Hello, and welcome to Parent Talks, presented by St. Michael's College School. My name is John Connelly, Director of Student Affairs at the school and the moderator for this event. Parent Talks is an initiative of the Student Affairs Department and Community and Learning Partnerships at the school. It began in May of 2019. Each Parent Talks event brings together subject matter experts and evidence-based research on topics of interest to current families at St. Michael's, specifically focused on the areas of wellness and mental health. Let's begin by honoring the traditional parents and grandparents of this land. I'll begin by acknowledging that I'm coming to you tonight from the school campus in Toronto, which means that I'm subject to Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. And I also acknowledge the traditional territory of many nations, including the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat, the Inuit, and the Métis peoples. Wherever you are joining us for this event, I hope you will acknowledge the First Nations and Indigenous communities of your region and any treaty commitments that you may have. Our focus this evening is on social and emotional learning for adolescents. As always, we invite you to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to ask questions, and our panel will try to get to as many of them as possible over the next 60 minutes. To our panelists now. Liat Benzacar is the Student Wellness Officer at St. Michael's College School. Liat is a certified social worker with a master's degree in that field. She has a particular interest in mental health and wellness as it pertains to children and families. She is also the mother of two. Dr. Mark Broussenko is a family physician and hospitalist at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health in Toronto. He has been the chief medical contributor for Parent Talks since its inception. Dr. Broussenko is also an alumnus of St. Michael's College School. And Kristy Onyeaju is the newest member of the Student Affairs team and a high school guidance counselor. She was the assistant head of the English department for several years and is one of the architects and coordinators of our Teacher Advisory Group program, or TAG program, and the moderator of the Modern Man Movement, or M3. She is also the mother of a little guy who, I'm told, had his second birthday yesterday. So happy birthday, Jackson. Let's get into it. State of the Union, what are you seeing from your professional vantage point in the fall of 22 as it pertains to social and emotional realities? Let's start with our newest member, Kristy. What are you seeing as a new member of the guidance department?
I think I'm observing a couple of trends, John. I'll start with the positives. So I think it goes without saying that coming out of the post-pandemic world, there's a immense desire for community and a sense of belonging. I think there's certainly a certain enthusiasm and energy within the building with the return of sports and clubs and the sending off of co-ordinating. I think from the guidance side of things specifically, some students still seem to be finding their groove academically, a little bit of stagnancy around academic performance and finding a balance now that co-curriculars have returned, and also maybe struggling to recover some of the skills that they didn't pick up because not all of our learners were best suited to the online format. As a bit of a concerning side of things personally, I think I'm feeling pressure to keep up with our character education programming, given some of the concerns that have come out of that kind of isolation that we saw during COVID. So when I think about the prevalency of screen time in particular apps, and I think about TikTok in particular, an app that's giving our students this kind of constant absorption of culture in little 20-second snippets without any context or any explanations or critical thought attached to that. So keeping in mind some of those factors, I think that's really what's at the forefront of my mind in my current role.
And what do you think of guidance so far?
Loving it, and I can't say I missed the marking.
Yeah, typical refrain of the English teacher. Dr. Broussenko, what are things looking like from your vantage point?
Thanks, John. Yeah, so definitely a lot of I think a lot of excitement for things to be fully reopened and people to be back and integrating and interacting with each other. So that's been very positive. There's a couple trends that are age related. So amongst younger children and kind of kids that are really entering school for the first time or really didn't have a ton of school age exposure previously. respiratory infections. So, things like respiratory syncytial virus or RSV are pretty endemic. And so we're seeing a lot of volume in our emergency departments and urgent cares from that perspective. So, definitely still a burden of physical disease. Older adolescents and young adults and the rest of the population at large, I think we're having quite a lot of early mental health presentations. So people coming out of the experience of the pandemic, starting to reintegrate back into kind of a more social and more fulsome life. I think are finding that some of their coping strategies, which have been a little bit rusty, and some of everyone's coping strategies throughout the pandemic are really being put to the test. So definitely higher rates of substance use and problematic substance use, and definitely higher amounts of social anxiety. So those are kind of some of the two of the bigger trends, and obviously everywhere in the world we have issues in terms of logistics and health system constraints and things like that. But that hasn't really changed very much over the last couple of years. It's just we've stopped accepting that as a temporary state. It's become more of a permanent fixture.
Right. Ms. Benzacar, how about you? What are you seeing in your office?
Yeah, just to sort of echo some of the things that were being said, I think that COVID-19 definitely brought on some mental health concerns, ones that came to the forefront, but I think we know that this is not a new concern. And while we're finding that students are, even in my office in the first 2 months, I have noticed a trend in increased drug use, increased social isolation. I think students are more readily available to make the time to come here and be in the office and make space to manage and expand their coping strategies. So I do find that while there's a decrease in sort of crisis management here in the school, with regard to mental health, I think there is a regular sort of steady pace of students coming in, ready to sort of, more openly talk about mental health supports or mental health concerns that they're managing. I think probably, a stress that we're seeing, and it's probably similar in the guidance office, is managing workload expectation. I think that there was a lot of grace and understanding with regard to online learning and adapting to the scenario that we were in. And so I think that there's a big shift in terms of what the expectation was before COVID at St. Michael's College School. Now that it's sort of back in place in our new normal, I think that there's definitely a lot of management around workload expectation and how to manage stress around that. Finally, I would say that there definitely have been a number of behavioral reminders for our students and managing being back in space in large groups of people. So that's something that I wouldn't say is critical or in a state of crisis, but definitely a couple of reminders here and there for our students of what it's like to be in a building full with students and what those expectations are.
Okay, so I've got a parent question here. So let's start with a really easy one. How do you manage the social pressures of drinking and drugs with adolescent boys? We ended with Liat. Let's start with Liat. What do you think? So drinking and drugs.
Sorry, and managing parent expectation?
I guess it's a parent question. So I think the question is around, as a parent, how do you respond? How do you direct your son?
Yeah, I think that this is a topic we've talked about in Parent Talks before, one that Dr. Broussenko has also sort of mentioned. So something that I will maybe repeat that he has said in the past is that most importantly, we can pretend that it's not happening and not pretend that our students won't have access in some way to alcohol and drug use. I think it's important for us to acknowledge and recognize what the difference between recreational drug use looks like in students and when it becomes a space of concern or abuse or addiction. I think if we see our students engaging in behavior and, ban it completely from the house and say, if you get into trouble, don't expect to call me, I think we can definitely, put some sort of concern with regard to safety. So if we're aware that we say it's not something that we approve, it's, illegal and you are underage. But if you find yourself in a scenario where you are at risk or your safety is of concern, that you can always be available as a parent to your child. I think open communication about these things are critical and important on an ongoing basis, and sharing with their, students why you might be concerned. The space where, shifts from recreational to managing emotion, managing pain. That would be one that, you can address with your student directly, or, direct them to the people in the building who'd be able to support either referrals or ongoing support.
Kristy, anything?
Yeah, I think Liat touched on a lot of really important points. The one major takeaway for me being the open communication piece. And I know for a lot of parents, it's a question of, how do you start and where to begin if these are things that you haven't talked about in the past. Certainly, a face-to-face confrontation of are you drinking or using drugs is not going to cover it. But I think starting with more simple questions about how they're spending their time, what they're involved in, what's important to them, and using that as kind of a context for how an increased use of those substances might have an impact on the things that they care about, as opposed to from a position of power, like Liat was saying, where one, you're assuming that it's not happening and you're making threats if it does, and creating a space where they can talk about some of the larger things in their life that might be driving them to that use or that outlet to begin with. And then I think education is so important too. I know we've done a lot of talks and workshops here over the years about vaping in particular, with the increase in that particular medium. And it's something that at a certain point, it seems to fall on deaf ears and there's eye rolls, but I think you can never keep pushing the education side of it, the health side of it, because so often, there's very little thought given to the larger health implications. And being that so many of our students are athletes, I know in the English department a few years ago, I had a grade 11 student write a personal essay on he was a cross country runner and the impact that vaping was having on his training. So it was unfortunate that he had to go that route. So I think, again, that messaging from coaches, from parents, from teachers, right? It's kind of a full circle approach of these are the concerns, these are the potential consequences, but also not following that conversation up with the shame factor, right? Where they feel embarrassed or vulnerable in a way where they can't talk about what's driving them to use.
So Mark, you alluded earlier to kind of an increase in prevalence of addiction cases and so on. Is there anything new here, or is it the same conversation we've been having?
So I mean, in some ways yes, in some ways no. So Liat raised a very good point. So there's a bunch of reasons that people are going to use substances, and some of them are healthier than others. Definitely using alcohol and recreational drugs, typically marijuana, but sometimes other things, as a form of mood modulator is pretty common. Lots of adults do it. I tend to encourage anyone that I see for whom I think that that's a form of as a coping strategy, so a form of chemical coping. I would really encourage those people to explore some other options, because we know that alcohol and cannabis products tend not to be very effective regulators of mood disorders and anxiety. So most of our best research suggests that people don't tend to do very well when they do that. So if you suspect that that's why your child is using substances problematically, then they should really have a conversation with someone about their mood. Sorry, I look like a Bond villain here with my cat. The other thing is, and I think we've harped on this topic a lot, but if it's more of a peer pressure and keeping up with the peer group type of activity, the reality is that these things become legal and widely available when kids turn 19, which also happens to be a time that the vast majority of students who in the population that we're talking about are going to be university bound. I tend to be in the least supervised environment. And what you want to do, or what I would suggest that you want to do is be forward thinking and teach your son in a more supervised and a safer setting how to navigate and manage those temptations, and how to navigate those challenges now before they become, 19 and do something, dangerously irresponsible in a setting where you have, less information, less oversight, less control. The problem is that our legal framework doesn't entirely align up with some of the other, in terms of like the age ranges for these things. So you can drive well before you're supposed to be able to buy any alcohol or any cannabis products. But we know that, the highest risk category for impaired driving are, adolescent boys, so 18 to 25. But, certainly any boys that are driving younger than that are going to be at high risk. So that's a dangerous and I think probably problematic overlap that at some point the legal system will address. That's the kind of thing to really watch out for, right? So the conversations about drugs really need to include safety concerns in terms of like, are you sure you're not doing this because you feel like you can't control your emotions? At which point there's other interventions. And if you're going to do this and here are the contexts, there are some situations where it's much safer than others. The most dangerous kinds of things tend to be impaired driving, right? Because that's life altering for both the person who's at fault in the accident and anyone else who's involved. And those are the kinds of decisions that are hard to go back on.
Yeah, for sure. All right, let's turn our attention to some SMCS programming, what's happened and what's coming up. Kristy, do you want to tell us a little bit about some of the programming and where we're headed this year?
So firstly, TAG, which is the Teacher Advisor Group program at the school, is returning to its original form. So that is grade cohorted groupings. So we have what we call our big brother groups from grades 10 to 12 and our little brother groups from grades 7 to 9. Part of the rationale for chunking the groups in that manner was so that we could pioneer age appropriate content for each of the two groups and create opportunities for mentorship. In building on some of the TAG programming at large, we're looking to support the school's strategic planning directives, particularly fostering well-being and belonging by helping students to develop healthy relationships, supporting mental wellness, and extending diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives within the program as well. I'm also really excited to mention the revival of the Modern Man movement, which you referred to earlier, Mr. Connelly. This program had some terrific momentum pre-COVID. For those parents who aren't so familiar with it, in its grassroots form, it really was a leadership initiative that sort of spilled over to a safe space to discuss what it means to be a boy in an all-boys school transitioning to post-secondary life. And from that came a larger curriculum around emotional intelligence, consent, healthy relationships, and training grade 11s and 12s to be conversant in these topics and then delivering modules to their younger peers. So we are looking to return that program to its fulsome scale this year, and I'm really excited about that one.
Yeah, I am too. Liat, so you're returning to us after a year on leave. So what are you excited about this year?
I am really excited at the momentum that the wellness team has created while I was away, and again this year on raising awareness campaigns that range from Suicide Awareness Prevention Day, Suicide Prevention Awareness Day, to things as simple as, keeping hydrated and wearing your backpack properly. We're excited to be able to run initiatives that are relevant to our student body, things like Movember, things like Bullying Awareness and Prevention Week, Student Engagement and Diversity, Equity and Inclusion, Mental Health Awareness Week, and just being able to be back in the classroom for ongoing support and, keeping a pulse on what's going on in the school and offering programming based on that. So I'm excited about all that.
So Mark, you're not in a school setting, obviously, but how does the character education that's happening in schools now compare to maybe what was the case when you were a student?
Yeah, I mean, I was looking. You were kind enough to send an update on some of the topics that you wanted to cover in this kind of State of the Union address. I think it's fantastic. I was actually kind of thinking in my head when I was getting ready for work this morning how I would talk about some of those questions, because this isn't really the type of thing that back in my day when we walked up, both ways in the snow and in the pouring rain, the conversation, the idea that some of these things would be taught to you was kind of expected to be more passive, right? So you would role model good behavior, and that was supposed to be kind of the end of it. And the idea that these conversations are being had explicitly, they're being had with students, they're being had with parents, is I think phenomenal. If anything, our society needs to have more of these conversations, right, about some of the challenging issues and some of the points of friction that we have in our society. Definitely in this context, right? So, if you're sending your child to the school, you're making a really significant investment in their future. And you're hoping to get a positive return on that investment, right? And part of that is teaching them, the fundamentals of reading and science and math and things like that. But a large part of that is learning social graces and getting the appropriate social graces in terms of being a respected leader and a respected member of your community. It's not, you're not innately born with that, right? That's a taught skill, and explicit teaching is really the best way to get that across.
On the subject of explicit teaching, so one of the questions that I faced, certainly when we started the Modern Man program and some of the talks that we would do at the grad retreats and specifically on the subject of consent and sexual consent. And I got this question from a faculty member at the school who said, why don't you just teach them abstinence? And wouldn't that solve all the problems if students were taught abstinence? Mark, what's your reaction to that?
Yeah, so take this with a grain of salt, right? So if you want religious advice, I strongly suggest you consult your priest. But my whole stance on this is that the concept of religion in general is consent based, right? And consent extending past even just the sexual domain, consent about everything, right? Your approach to your faith in your life is you get a book, it tells you what happens. You get to read it, and then you say, hey, I'm in for this, or no, I'm not. But everything, it's a fairly clear transaction on both sides. You know what you're going to get, and you know what's expected of you. And there are people who help you interpret how you apply that to your life. And I think that's a lesson. That's one of the core tenets of faith. I think that's a lesson that you take into a lot of other places in your life. And I think that's one of the things that, I think St. Mike stands for. And that's one of the virtues that we should be really focusing on teaching. Because conversations about sexual consent don't start and end with premarital sex, right? They start and end with how people, interact with their coworkers in their workplace. They have conversations about, specifically in this context, how adolescent boys and young men view their female peers, how they view, the women that they interact with in the world, how they view their female teachers, how they what understanding they have of the role of women in society, and the kinds of expectations that they have of that. And so, I think if you're looking to create strong men, strong leaders, and your expectation is that by teaching them abstinence, you're going to incorporate all of those other things that I mentioned, I think that falls short of the mark, right? There's a tremendous conversation about the value and the contributions of their female peers that doesn't even get touched by that. And the reality is that entitlement is a bad look, right? As we see increasingly more in the modern world, even if you're going to be really pragmatic about it, being an entitled young man, this is now possibly the worst time in the world to live like that. Like, don't do it. We have the opportunity to be better.
Yeah. Liat, what does consent mean from your vantage point?
Again, just to echo what Dr. Broussenko was saying, consent is a necessary part of our lives in all aspects, right? It's not just sexual or romantic. And it's just the interactions that we have with others that take place by giving and getting consent, right? It could be as simple as ordering a pizza, right? Inviting somebody over to your house. And I think what's so important about teaching consent, particularly as it relates to emotional intelligence, is that it's important to be able to manage rejection, right? And so if I want a pizza and the person I'm ordering it wants something else, I have to be able to emotionally regulate in that moment when I get rejected. Another reason why it's also dangerous to teach abstinence and abstinence only is because we're removing what it might be for somebody to give rejection. How do I say no? Right? It removes peer pressure from the scenario. And that's something that I think is prevalent in all scenarios where teenagers are. And so I think it's important to be able to teach emotional intelligence to ensure that our children have emotionally intelligent conversations, not just at home, but in school, so that they're able to interpret and understand what consent is, what consent is not, and that consent can change. And so I think, we remove things from the table when we're talking about abstinence, because there are things that we can't control for in the environment where children are sometimes, and peer pressure would definitely be one of those things.
Kristy, anything else? Why is it incumbent on schools and character education to take this on? Isn't this the role of the family?
Sorry, can you just repeat the last part, John?
The question is, isn't this the role of the family? So to those who would say, that this is the purview of the family to talk about, values and morals, what do you think?
So I think to dovetail on what Dr. Broussenko mentioned about why parents send their students to St. Mike's. So our vision is to graduate young men who will challenge the world through lives of faith, character, and service. The character part of that, in conjunction with their faith and its application to the real world, is the most relevant piece of that. And we've always approached the topic of consent through the modern man and through the encompassing curriculum by rooting it in the context of statistical realities. So I mentioned earlier the importance of giving context to some of these myths or notions that are prevalent in society and on social media. And in Canada, for us, that means 1 in 4 women in North America will be a victim of sexual assault, 1 in 6 men. Although this figure is likely much higher because we know boys and men are less likely to report these instances. 1 out of every 100 sexual assaults, only 6 are reported to police. And 60% of sexual abuse victims are under the age of 17. And I think most important to highlight is that 1 in 3 Canadians know what consent is. So when we're talking about the importance of teaching this and the prevalence it has in our lives and in a post-secondary environment, which is all the more alarming, this information needs to be taught. Statistics Canada has some insights on the post-secondary culture and world for students, and they mentioned that 71% of students have witnessed or experienced unwanted sexual behaviors, either on or off campus or in an online situation. I bring these statistics up for our parents not to suggest an implication of wrongdoing on the part of our students, but in connecting it back to the vision piece, the notion that we believe in their potential for goodness, to be allies, because the odds are that they have a woman in their life or a friend in their life who's been afflicted by this type of violence. And the odds are that they're going to encounter it in a post-secondary world. So we really believe in giving them the tools to be able to respond, to enact appropriate bystander options, whether that be to directly confront, to delegate, to delay, or to distract. So we give them tools, we give them options for managing these types of scenarios, which again, statistically suggest they will be in and they will encounter in post-secondary life.
Dr. Broussenko, a thought?
Thanks. Yeah, so Kristy actually raised a really, really good point that I just wanted to elaborate on. One of the expectations I think people reasonably have when they make a really significant investment in their children and their future is that they hope that those people become leaders. I don't think it's a far stretch to say that many of the parents that are sending their kids to St. Mike's really hope that those people will become leaders and educators and role models in their field. And a large part of that in the modern world, a large part of leadership 200 years ago was an understanding of military tactics and, horseback riding and the etiquette of court. A large part of that in the modern world, which is, the place that you're training your kids for, is an understanding on how to have conversations with people about delicate issues. It's an understanding of the kinds of vulnerabilities that your peers, your superiors, your employees will face, And it's knowing how to handle those things when things come up, right? It's knowing how to be a good friend, a good partner, a good son, a good member of your community, because that's the expectation of leadership, right? To those for whom much is given, from them much is owed. Or I think Peter Parker maybe said a little bit more eloquently than that. But it's this idea that you're supposed to be putting your children out there, and you're supposed to be proud of their conduct, right? The other thing that's a bad look is sanctimoniousness. And I think having a conversation about, whatever your personal morals are, right? Understanding that, that there are consent or boundary violations, or there are other forms of conflict. Having a sanctimonious approach is absolutely not what you are paying $20,000 a year to teach your child. It looks bad, it's ineffective. And I think you can do much better, right? You can approach these things with a lot more nuance and grace. And then you can use that as a touchstone for how you have these conversations.
Yeah. Liat, you talked about emotional intelligence. For all our benefit, what is emotional intelligence and why is it important?
Yeah, pretty basically, emotional intelligence is the ability to understand and manage emotion. So recognizing your own emotion and recognizing the emotion of others. So that often looks like self-awareness, self-regulation, having, good social skills, empathy, and motivation. And so we use emotional information in our environment to guide our thinking and behavior. And so I think that it's important, and something probably we'll touch on a little bit later, that we're able to discern between our feelings. We're able to label them and understand them. And not only that we're able to actually to adjust our emotions to the environment that we're in. So, I mean, that's sort of a basic understanding of emotional intelligence. There's a lot of connections for individuals who are categorized as emotionally intelligent. They're more likely to have increased mental health, decreased depression, their performance skills, whether that be in public speaking, in sports, in arts, is increased. They're often the people we see in leadership positions, and they often, are able to be empathetic. I'm sure Dr. Broussenko will comment that these are not things that we can say that they're mutually exclusive, meaning that, there are variables obviously that we can't account for. It's a chicken or egg type scenario. Are people more likely to be leaders because they were emotionally intelligent, or is the opposite true? But we definitely see people who have, high emotional intelligence, or EQ as it's called, that they have better relationships because they're really able to manage conflict well. So, I mean, I think that this is, important for us, particularly in the development of deep friendships for boys and men, because it's critical for emotional intelligence and development of emotional intelligence. So that's a definite source of support, is boys' friendships. Now, if you're concerned that you or your child isn't, emotionally intelligent, the good news is that we can learn it. We can model it every day. We can find opportunity to discuss and expand our emotional vocabularies. But yeah, as it stands, it's the ability to understand and manage your emotion as it pertains to yourself and the people around you.
So Kristy, how does emotional intelligence fit into the programming at the school?
So just to sort of dovetail on Liat here, there's a really great article I wanted to mention for parents. It's called it's published in Greater Good magazine, which is a Berkeley research publication. The article is called Why We Should Help Boys Embrace All Their Feelings, and I'd be happy to share the resource after the seminar. But the article was co-written by a psych professor at Yale and a practicing psychologist at California Irvine. And it talks about a new field of research called emodiversity, which is this idea that the brain is an ecosystem that benefits from experiencing a range of emotions. And we know that the most socially reinforced emotions for boys are anger and apathy. And I think there's really important connections to everything that Dr. Broussenko has touched on tonight with regards to mental health, substance abuse, And we know in the academic context, the underachieving and the idea that boys are being left behind in the classroom takes root in a lack of those abilities to express that wide array of emotions. So in terms of our relevancy here for programming, we've been leveraging Harvard's Ruler program within some of our tag content with our modern man modeling. It's informed the wellness initiative. It's really made its way into a variety of clubs and initiatives around the building, and it's reinforcing a more diverse vocabulary of emotions in different contexts. We tend to kind of root it at high stress periods within the year. So going into exams, for example, we've done things on stress management. We've used this bucket analogy before of using that as kind of a tangible thing that boys can use to evaluate how their stress is piling up and when the bucket is pouring over, strategies for pouring the bucket out before it starts seeping out. And then we've also used the mood meter in the past and rooted that sort of in our safe space agreement. So it comes down to a lot of group norming, modeling in our program, and sort of maybe unadvertised lessons that kind of make their way into these different initiatives and clubs where we're just trying to give our students a wider vocabulary and a bigger tap into how they're feeling.
So safe space agreements get a bit of a bum rap right now. What exactly is a safe space agreement? Why is it important, Kristy?
So it really is the tone that gets set at any group meeting. So we've used them for staff meetings before and staff breakout rooms. We've used them in TAG. I'm sure the wellness group has used them, but it's an agreed upon set of norms for regulating the conversation every time that the group meets. And it kind of becomes your charter for conduct when the group gathers. And it's something that you revisit at the start of every meeting. And it's used, and the co-construction really matters because it has each participant personally invested in the construction, and it also appeals to the different varying comfort levels of the participants. So right to pass is an important one. So you don't feel pressured to respond to every question or every statement. The notion that what is said in that space stays in that space. So you're not leaving tag, for example, and saying, do you know what so-and-so said in there? And again, a reinforcement of these really helps to build trust, build community, and tries to promote the kind of emotional intelligence that we're talking about.
So Mark, is it true that boys and men have a harder time with emotional regulation?
Broadly, yes. So it's a complicated question. We can start with some things that are they're just objectively evident. So men account for about 75% of all causes of death by suicide in Canada. I had to look up the stat because it's slightly different by country, which actually suggests that this reflects partially in the ways in which we're socialized. Men account for over 80% of overdose deaths in Canada as well. Our most recent literature suggests that on most scales that tend to measure emotional intelligence, at least in the kind of North American context that we look at it, men tend to perform worse than women. And a large part of that has been, the historical socialization of boys. And a large part of this conversation isn't necessarily talking about end stage dysfunction, but I raise those statistics as a backdrop so that people can kind of have a sense of the magnitude of the difference. We're hoping to create healthy, well-adjusted, children of either sex, but a large part of the way that we socialize children, creates differences in how has historically created differences in how they've been allowed to express their feelings and how they've been allowed to talk about them. One of the things that I wish everyone learned more in school is a vocabulary and a language for understanding your own feelings. I have lots of young adults that come to me and they tell me they're like, I feel off. Okay, what does that mean? Right? There's a language out there beyond I feel sad, I feel angry, I feel anxious. Okay, what kinds of things stress you out? Well, everything. Okay, when are you sad? All the time. Right. And I don't blame them, right? I'm not suggesting that they're difficult teenagers, but this is like having a conversation about, about different fruit without knowing the nomenclature for this is a berry, this is a, it's a citrus fruit or whatever. Everything is an orange, everything is everything's a banana. And so, teaching people how to have a vocabulary about how to talk about their feelings, I think is very important, because then they have the words to ask for help when they need it. But then that conversation also allows them to start to get insight into other people's feelings, right? This idea that the world, the concept known, epistemologically as sonder, the idea that other people in the world also exist with, with emotions and lives and goals and aspirations other than your own, that we're not just surrounded by, non-person characters, right? That the people that you interact with aren't just populated by, a video game to be, discarded whenever you're bored with them, that they also have their feelings and goals. And that form of emotional intelligence, right, having the language to understand your own feelings, gives you the ability to, imagine and perceive other people's feelings and responses, and to understand how to have conversations with them. Sometimes to ask for help when you need it, and sometimes to realize that they, when they're asking for help in some subtle ways. And going back to what I was saying previously, right, to orient this in the context of why does this matter? Because this is how you create effective leaders and effective partners and effective contributors in the modern world. Liat was talking about do great leaders have higher degrees of emotional intelligence? Historically, maybe not, but that's because a lot of leadership positions historically were not earned on the basis of merit. They were hereditary or on the basis of other forms of power and wealth. As we move towards a more meritocratic world with an increasing level of competition for every position, understanding how the people around you feel can't possibly hurt, right? And I don't pretend to have all of the literature under my command for how this improves job performance, but in every possible formulation, right, this is only an asset. And so having that conversation about just starting to teach boys especially a vocabulary to talk about their feelings pays so many dividends down the road, right? They can read at a slightly worse level, and their appreciation of Shakespeare can be just this tiny little bit worse. But if they're able to identify why it is that they feel sad, their life productivity will go way up.
Yeah, the evidence suggests that having a broader lexicon around emotions is in itself a real boon as far as improving EQ. I'm going to share my screen very briefly here because sometimes we're asked, for some practical tips, things that we can share with parents. So I'm going to share something that we do with our students in our programming, and it's called an EI charter, or an emotional intelligence charter. And this comes to us from Ruler, which is through Yale University, as Kristy mentioned. And it helps us to create positive, supportive, social, emotional environments. And a charter is basically an agreement between people that speaks to our common need to express ourselves emotionally and to be in community with one another. And the charter, or the agreement, is guided by two questions. And panelists, feel free to jump in here if you have thoughts, but how do you want to feel when we're together? And how will these feelings help each other? How will we help each other to have these feelings more often? So if we can answer those two questions, then that's helpful. Now, is it a cheesy thing to suggest that families have their own emotional intelligence charter or their own agreement? Why is it important to kind of articulate some of these thoughts as a family? Like, surely we're a family. We know we love one another. We know we've got each other's backs. Kristy, you got your hand up.
I was just laughing to myself reading the first question, because I know in my time over the years meeting with parents, one of the ones that inevitably comes up all the time was, I ask him how his day was or what he did at school, and he says fine and nothing. So I think that really speaks to sometimes the limited frame of reference or words that they have to actually explain how something as simple as how their day was. So it's teaching this and modeling some of these things as a way for it to kind of spill over to those sort of seemingly mundane exchanges in your day-to-day life, right? Of wanting to connect, but not really them not having the tools to do so, and you not knowing where to go after you get a response like fine. It's kind of a conversation stopper. So
Mark, a thought?
Yeah, so I mean, I actually think this is, I think this is fantastic. And I would, for people who think they don't need this, I'm going to give you some examples from some extremely high performing teams. So one of the things that's often studied in critical response medicine is how to effectively coordinate teams of highly skilled and highly trained providers, but how to get the best out of all of those people when they're working together. And there's a lot of literature that actually looks at very subtle differences that really improve end outcomes and end function. And a lot of that stuff is really basic, right? It's role identification. Who's doing what. It's frequent opportunities for feedback and clarification, right? It's two-way communication. So I think you're not feeling well. Do you agree with that? Can you tell me if that's true or not? But a big part of that is a debrief, right? Even people who've worked together for hundreds, if not thousands of cases afterwards, have something like this, right? What did we try to do? Did it go well? How will we do it better in the future? And I mean, you can extrapolate this into other, extremely high performing situations. Extremely common in sports teams, right? Stereotypically, the football team, there's a huddle, right? They call a play. They talk about the play. They've called 1,000 plays together. Why do they need to do that? Why don't they just say one thing and go? But the reality is you can see the people that do this well, and you can see the people that do this badly. And a big part of being able to integrate this into your life is getting past the idea that this is stupid and that this should just happen on its own, right? Have the 5-minute family sit down time to talk about how your kids are feeling. The 9 times out of 10, they'll tell you that they're fine and it's whatever. But even if just the one time they bring up an issue and that you change the course of that particular dynamic in their lives, totally worth it.
So a family charter so as a family, how do we want to feel? And as a family, we might agree that we want to feel loved, valued, understood, happy, and safe. And then specifically, what are the behaviors that we could engage that could help us have these feelings more often? So this is why it's important. You have to attach each one of these desired outcomes to a specific behavior that will promote that outcome. Liat, what does that look like for families?
I mean, I think it's a more involved way to actually, think about what emotions are and how we ensure that they happen. I mean, going back to the initial question and the thing that Kristy was sort of giggling about to herself, like when we ask weak questions, we will often get weak responses. So asking the question, how are you? It's easy to answer, okay, fine, good, right? That's a knee-jerk reaction. But when we ask a more thoughtful question, how would you like to feel? And how can I ensure that? Hey, this is another space where consent fits in. If to feel loved, I want to be hugged, and I want to be hugged every night before I put my kids to bed. I have to make sure that that is going to be the desired action to make my child feel loved, right? When they're a teenager, maybe they're not going to agree to that anymore. And so how do we shift that, right? I feel loved by having my lunch made for me every day. That's how I feel love for my family. I feel valued when at the table. I don't just hear the question, how was school? I hear, oh, today was that thing you were going to do. Can you tell me about it? I was really excited to know. And that's where, these actions will sort of fall into place, feeling understood, feeling happy, and most importantly, feeling safe.
And it's different for different people, right? Like,
Right.
The books on love languages, I think, are instructive. So for some people, it's acts of service. For other people, it's touch. For other people, it's quality time. For other people, it's gifts. And empathy is assuming the emotional perspective of other people and recognizing their vantage point and not just our own. Kristy, you had a thought?
yeah, just you spoke to it just there with love languages. I was thinking about what Liat was saying about the potential for the family dynamic. And I think I really want to emphasize the potential for role modeling and sort of nonverbal cues as well, right? So not just the dialogue itself, but what you might be able to do in terms of showing that affection in an alternate way. If you are a parent who doesn't typically talk about your own feelings, right, maybe modeling that for your child in kind of gradual increments at family dinner. We're going to sit down tonight and I'm just going to tell you a little bit about my day, and use some of the language and model it for them so they hear it, it becomes part of their vocabulary, and then all of a sudden, you know, they're able to give you a little bit more than fine, you know, a few weeks down the road.
And when conflict happens, it's important not just to have recrimination, right? It's important to have restorative practice within the family or within the school community, where we reflect not only on what happened to us and what our role was, but also how others may have felt as the result of our behavior. Liat, why is it important to reflect in that way and not just to take a punitive approach to discipline in a home?
It's funny. I was actually just telling you this story the other day, which is we were walking on St. Clair, and my toddler was just finishing after a full day of school and then karate, and we walked by, and there a group of St. Mike's staff were sitting, and I was so excited. And I said, "Here are a bunch of my pals. I'm excited to introduce you to them." And there was a moment where she sort of played along and showed her karate belt, and she was excited. And then she, sort of shouts rather loudly, "Let's get out of here. I'm done with this." And so my initial reaction was to be upset and embarrassed, right? In that moment, like, oh, this is kind of awkward. And she ran off, and so did I, obviously. But then when I reflected with her later, instead of being angry and punitive, I said, "Hey, what happened over there? Like, I was kind of sad that you weren't, that you kind of blew my friends off." And she says, "Well, Mommy, I was feeling very shy." Right. And I would never want to react in a punitive way to a child who is feeling shy. And we can, sort of, talk a little bit more about that, obviously. But then more importantly, I can also reflect on how it made me feel and share that with her. Right. And she can now say, okay, so maybe moving forward, and she's only 4, so it might be more effective with teenagers. But I think oftentimes, particularly in those moments where we're feeling embarrassed or sad, we can react in a way that doesn't actually reflect our emotion, and that is not often taken by the people around us well. And so I think it's also important, again, when building emotional intelligence, to know, how does my behavior impact those around me? When I'm feeling angry and I flip a desk, are people going to feel comfortable coming into my office again? The answer is likely no. And so, if I do, for example, respond in a way that's punitive or angry, I might say to myself, "You know what, next time I'm going to ask you how you feel, because I didn't realize you were feeling shy. I just thought you were being nasty." Right. And so I know next time I can ask you, "Hey, if you're feeling shy, you can just hold my hand," instead of bolting the other way and saying, "Let's get out of here."
And so when a parent and child have conflict, and they will, these questions are not just for the child, right? These questions are for the parent as well. Yeah.
That's
Mark,
right.
Yeah. Mark, you had a thought?
Yeah, so I really, really appreciate that example, Leah, because I think that really encapsulates really a couple of things we've been talking about. So one of the reasons that like toddlers and preschool age children act out is because they feel something, and they don't have either any words, or they don't have the the nuanced words to tell you how they feel, right? So they might feel hungry, or might feel uncomfortable, or they might feel threatened or something. Those are complicated emotions, and it's easier to stomp and scream and go rah. And then slowly over time, we teach them, we teach them better ways of expressing that. We teach them social graces. They figure out, more elegant ways to extricate themselves from situations. When teenagers act out, and they often do it in more sophisticated ways, although some teenagers definitely do stomp their feet and still go ah, it's largely because they don't have either the language to express their complex feelings, or necessarily they might not have picked up on the types of social graces that let you easily exit that uncomfortable situation, right? And that's the kind of thing that gets taught in a lot of places. It gets taught in sports teams, it gets taught at schools, but it gets taught in the home. All of those places are important, and all of those places contribute to it differently. But really, there's a huge emphasis here in having those conversations in all of the spheres. because it's really challenging if you learn some new ways of talking about your feelings at school or at soccer practice to then come home and not have an arena to practice that communication style. And because everyone always asks us for practical hands-on advice, the one thing I will suggest is for you to normalize giving answers that are more dynamic and sophisticated than just "I'm okay." One of the things I notice is I often ask people how they're doing when they come into my office. It's just a common courtesy. Everyone says they're okay. And one of the things I'll often say is, "Are you sure? Because I think you're limping." "Oh yeah, I'm here because my leg hurts." You're struggling to breathe." "Oh yeah, my asthma flare is really bad." Normalize that it's okay not to respond to that question with just a bland affirmative. And you can do that in a couple of ways, right? If you ask your child, "How are things at school?" "Okay. Yeah, you seem a little bit down on the car ride this morning. Everything okay?" Kind of pry into it further. But the other way is to model it and say, "Well, I didn't have that great of a day." And share some of your experiences so that they start to learn some of the language and some of the ways that you'd like for them to share how they're feeling.
Just maybe throw in quickly, like another thing that also makes it difficult for us to manage emotion and to be able to express it in an adaptive way is sleep and diet. And we know that that's something that our students in school are not getting regularly. And so there are days where we see students in the school who seem really able to manage conflict and deal with emotion and reflect on those sort of questions that you showed earlier. And then there are days where we see them show up in more maladaptive ways, whether that be anger outbursts, whether that be drug use, whether that be self-harm. And so, I think it's important to acknowledge and recognize that sleep and diet, getting the right amount of sleep and eating, your 3 meals a day and your snacks and keeping fuel in the tank, like those things, in the absence of those things, we definitely see a decrease in emotional functioning, cognitive functioning, and impulse control. So, I know that it's difficult in the days of technologies and screens and now with the expected workload that's coming on, but something that we can do to sort of support emotional intelligence and ability to manage emotion is through managing those things too.
Well said. One question we got in the chat, and we also got one previously, and we've had such a good conversation, we didn't get to it much, but was social media. So I'm going to take that to mean we might have interest in a full session on social media and its implications and what it means for adolescents, maybe in a future session. So stay tuned. We'll cover social media coming up in a future session. But in the meantime, I want to thank you, and I want to thank in a special way Dr. Broussenko, Ms. Onyeaju, and Ms. Benzacar for sharing once again their expertise with us this evening. They're all veterans of Parent Talks. I want to thank all the parents who took the time to join us this evening and to let you know that we value your feedback. So I believe there's a survey that you'll be asked to complete at the end of this program. And you can also email parenttalks@smcsmail.com if you have any ideas about future topics, in addition to social media that you'd like to see covered. And yeah, just tell us what you're thinking, or you know where to find at least 3 of us on EDSB if you have more feedback, or if you need more assistance, or if you require some help from the Student Affairs Department, feel free to reach out to Ms. Benzacar or Ms. Onyeaju or one of the members of our guidance team. And once again, we thank you so much for joining us this evening. And we wish you good mental health and good health generally, and a wonderful evening. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.